What is wealth disparity? Wealth disparity, or otherwise known as economic inequality, is when income is dispersed unequally. The less equal the distribution of income, the higher income inequality becomes. Many factors play key roles in wealth disparity, such as the racial wealth divide, the rise in wealth concentrations, and divides in taxation. Especially when discussing the topic of wealth disparity in schools, a household's amount of income plays a quintessential role in our level of education. For example, 46% of children from high-income households will complete all 4 years of college. Only 24% of children from low-income families will.
In this presentation, we'll be discussing how wealth disparity affects teachers, children, and taxpayers. How is wealth disparity important to teachers and taxpayers? In Texas, public schools get their funding from a combination of local property taxes and the average daily attendance, or the basic atonement for every student. Texas has a strange divide of concentrated areas with higher property taxes and areas with low property taxes. Schools in areas with higher property taxes are able to gain more funds compared to schools located in lower property tax areas. In addition to the mass difference in property tax values in Texas, public schools also get funding from student attendance. This means the more students are actively attending school, the more funding the school gets. This also means that if fewer students are going to school, the less funding the school gets. This causes schools to have different standards or a variety of classes, materials, and activities that are available for both teachers and students. Wealth disparity is important to both teachers and taxpayers because it gives unequal and unfair advantages to schools that have students that are constantly attending school and are gaining funds from areas with higher property taxes. Schools with little to no attendance and fewer funds from property taxes have very little to spend on materials and classes to properly provide for taxpayers' children and have them ready for their future. Albert Cortez, an expert witness in major state school finances and immigrant education cases, summarized the wealth disparity in public schools in Texas the best. Inequity in public school funding in Texas is due to the state's failure to neutralize great differences in taxable property wealth, and referred to as district wealth, where the poorest school districts have about $10,000 of taxable property per student, while the wealthiest have access to over $1 million per student.
Wealth disparity in the present. Wealth disparity plays a major role when it comes to student funding in Texas. In Texas, it's been shown that the gap between low-income areas compared to wealthier ones is severely high. According to a 2018 study conducted by the Rice Institute of Urban Research, the national per-student spending was $11,762 in 2016, but few of Texas' largest school districts even approach that number. In addition, some of Texas' largest school districts, such as HISD, only spend $9,633 for every student, not even nearly reaching the spending per student in the country. Houston, alongside other large schools in Texas, fall below the national average when it comes to per-student spending and state funding. It's been studied that the more the districts relied on property taxes, the larger the disparities. Therefore, the more lower-income districts rely on federal funding, the higher their taxes become. Here we examine a graph that shows the student funding per student in 2018 here in Texas. We can conclude from this data that 51% of the school districts spent nearly $10,000 or less per student. This is over less than half of what other students receive at a national level. The disparity here is clearly unbalanced, and it shows how the students are being affected by something completely out of their control. In schools today, there are many who have the privilege of giving their students laptops or electronic devices for assignment and exams. But what about those schools that don't have the funds for that? This affects teachers along with students because if in the near future we, for instance, work for a school district where the income is low, then that will mean a lack of resources for us to teach the content required in order for us to deliver it to the students.
The history of wealth disparity. The change of wealth disparity in Texas is due to the change in demographics. People from different backgrounds, status, and incomes are moving into Texas, which causes a change in Texas demographics and makes the wealth disparity greater. People are coming in and bringing with them their income that ranges from very high to very low and affects property tax values depending on where they decide to settle down.
Students that come from lower income families in Houston are only 40% likely to finish 2 or more years of college. The same percentage of those from higher income families are likely to graduate all 4 years of college. Showing income directly ties into one's opportunity and ability to receive higher education. Schools that are properly funded will be able to better and prepare students to move from high school level education onto the collegiate level.
What impacts has wealth disparity had on students and schools? Students who come from low-income communities and households are more likely to be at a disadvantage when it comes to public school funding. As the percentage of the minority student increases, the funding per student decreases. That is unfair and unjust to the students in the education system. If a student belongs to a low-income community, then they should be receiving more funding and support and not the opposite.
Importance of wealth disparity. It is important to be aware of the wealth disparity in Texas and how it affects both teachers and taxpayers. Teachers in schools that are located in areas of low property taxes and have low student attendance rates are less likely to get the proper funding to obtain needed and wanted teaching materials and school supplies. Taxpayers not only determine how much a public school can get funding, but taxpayers may also be parents sending their children to these underfunded schools. Their children may not receive the proper education they need to succeed in their life and future.
Overall, wealth disparity plays a major role in determining the quality and quantity of education we receive. Considering the current pandemic, where many students don't have access to the digital tools necessary to fulfill school requirements, and thanks to school low funding and preparation for the impact of COVID-19, it is important to understand the scope of factors that play key roles in wealth disparity. We would all like to think that education is equal, but in a climate where race, the quantity of students, and federal and state funding play major roles, this is simply not the case. The reality is the lower income schools that need a raise in funding won't receive it, which affects the level of the education that they'll receive.
And this